The laughter started before the fish ever touched the water. That was the funny part. People remembered the tilapia. Margaret Hale remembered the meeting. The exact meeting. The exact laugh. The exact moment the entire county decided she'd finally lost her mind. It happened inside the co-op conference room on a rainy February afternoon. Farmers filled every chair. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Weather forecasts covered one wall. Commodity prices covered another. The discussion centered on a problem everyone understood. Soil. Specifically, tired soil. Fields weren't performing like they used to. Input costs kept rising. Fertilizer bills climbed every season. Yields stayed stubborn. Nobody seemed happy. Then Margaret raised her hand. Never a good sign. At least according to Dale Harper. Dale immediately leaned back. Oh no. Margaret looked over. What? Dale pointed his coffee cup. That look. Silence. What look? The ideal look. The room laughed. Because everybody knew it. Margaret only attended meetings when she wanted answers. Or when she thought she'd found one. Neither situation usually ended normally. The co-op manager sighed. What are you thinking? Margaret stood. Walked toward the whiteboard. And drew a ditch. Then another. Then several connecting channels. The room watched quietly. Then she drew fish. Silence. Absolute silence. Then. No. Margaret turned around. What? Dale pointed at the fish. No. Long pause. What? Fish. Yes. Why? Margaret smiled slightly. Good question. The Hale farm sat across nearly 600 acres of Missouri bottomland. Rich ground. At least it used to be. Her grandfather Samuel Hale often described the soil as black cake batter. Dark. Soft. Alive. By the time Margaret inherited the operation, things looked different. Not terrible. Just different. Years of intensive production slowly changed the land. Organic matter dropped. Water retention weakened. Inputs increased. Every year seemed to require more fertilizer to achieve similar results. Samuel noticed long before anyone else. One summer evening when Margaret was 14, she followed him through a soybean field after a heavy rain. The water disappeared quickly. Too quickly. Samuel knelt, scooped soil into his hands, then frowned. Feel that? Margaret took some. The dirt felt dry despite recent rain. Crumbly. Tired. She looked confused. What's wrong? Samuel tossed the soil aside. Nothing. Long pause. Then. Yet. That answer stayed with her. Because over time she realized something. Healthy soil behaves differently. It holds water differently. Supports life differently. Recovers differently. The distinction mattered. Years later, after Samuel passed away, Margaret inherited not only the farm, but his notebooks. Hundreds of them. Field observations. Rainfall records. Yield histories. Wild ideas. Everything. One particular notebook fascinated her. Because Samuel seemed obsessed with biology. Earthworms. Microbes. Organic matter. Natural nutrient cycles. The entries felt strange, especially compared to modern farming. Yet the deeper she read, the more interesting things became. Years later drought hit. Then another drought. Then another. Each one exposed the same weakness. Fields lacked resilience. The soil simply wasn't what it once was. Margaret started researching alternatives. Cover crops. Composting. Reduced tillage. Everything. Then one article changed everything. Not because it contained answers. Because it contained fish. Specifically, integrated farming systems used in parts of Asia. Rice. Water. Fish. Nutrients. Natural biological cycles. The concept fascinated her. Most people would have forgotten about it. Margaret didn't. Which led directly to the co-op meeting. And the fish drawings. Dale rubbed his forehead. No. Margaret folded her arms. Yes. No. Yes. The room laughed again. The co-op manager looked exhausted. Explain. Margaret pointed at the drawing. We move irrigation water through miles of ditches every year. Nobody argued. That part was true. The farm relied heavily on irrigation channels. Miles of them. Then she pointed at the fish. Fish produce nutrients. Silence. Then. So. Fish waste feeds biology. More silence. Fish stir sediment. Fish consume algae. Fish contribute organic material. Dale stared. Then. You want to put fish in ditches? Margaret smiled. Yes. The room erupted. Not angrily. Worse. Amused. The kind of laughter reserved for ideas people don't consider dangerous enough to argue against. Margaret sat down. The meeting moved on. But the jokes remained. For weeks. At the diner. At the co-op. At church. Everywhere. Dale created new material constantly. Good news, everybody. Rick Harlow looked up. What? Margaret's opening a seafood farm. Laughter spread through the room. Margaret kept drinking coffee, ignoring them, mostly, but privately. The idea wouldn't leave, because the more she researched, the more it made sense. The next spring she ordered tilapia. Not many, just enough to test. The delivery alone caused excitement. A specialized tank truck rolled into the farmyard carrying thousands of juvenile fish. Half the county seemed to appear, Dale included. Naturally, he climbed out of his truck, stared at the tanks, then at Margaret, then back again. No. Margaret smiled. Morning. Dale pointed dramatically. No. Silence. What? The fish. Yes. Fish. Yes. On a farm. Yes. Long pause. Then, you actually did it. Margaret nodded. I did. The first stocking day looked ridiculous. At least according to spectators. Fish splashed into irrigation channels. Workers released fingerlings. Water churned. Children watched. Neighbors laughed. Dale nearly cried from happiness. Because this was exactly the kind of story small towns love. Something unusual. Something different. Something easy to mock. That lasted until summer. Then things became strange. Very strange. The fish survived. Not all, but enough. The irrigation ditches remained cleaner than usual. Algae decreased noticeably. Water quality improved. Margaret noticed immediately. Nobody else cared. Yet, one evening Emily Hale stood beside a ditch watching hundreds of tilapia move through shallow water. Still think this works? Margaret looked down, then toward the nearby fields. Then back. Maybe. Emily smiled. That's optimistic. Margaret laughed softly. No. Long pause. Then, what's optimistic? The fish. Summer became autumn. The fish grew rapidly. Much faster than expected. The irrigation system functioned normally. Nothing disastrous happened, which disappointed many observers, especially Dale, because a dramatic failure would have been entertaining. Instead, nothing, at least externally. Internally, Margaret started noticing something. Field sections closest to the irrigation network looked different. Subtle differences. Healthier color. Better moisture retention. More biological activity. Not dramatic. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to attract attention. One September afternoon, she walked fields with a crop consultant. The consultant stopped, kicked at the soil, then frowned. That's interesting. Margaret looked over. What? He knelt, scooped soil, examined it carefully, then stood. Have you changed something? Silence. Then, maybe. The consultant looked across the field, then toward the ditch, then back again. You've got more biological activity. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Really? He nodded. Yes. Long pause. Then, why? Margaret looked toward the water, toward the fish, then smiled slightly. Because she already knew what everyone would say. Fish couldn't improve farmland. Fish belonged in ponds, or lakes, or dinner plates, not irrigation ditches, which was exactly why nobody expected what happened next. Because the following growing season, the numbers started arriving. The numbers arrived in July, and at first, Margaret thought they were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just enough to make her suspicious. The yield monitor showed stronger production in field sections nearest the irrigation ditches. Not by a little, by enough to matter. She checked again, then a third time. Same result. The areas closest to the water consistently outperformed the rest of the farm. One afternoon, Emily found her standing beside a computer screen. Yield maps covered the display. Color-coded sections stretched across hundreds of acres. Emily frowned. You've been staring at that for an hour. Margaret nodded. Yes. Long pause. Good staring or bad staring? Margaret pointed at the screen. The ditch fields. Emily looked. Then looked again. Then, what about them? Margaret zoomed in. The highest-performing zones followed the irrigation network almost perfectly, like someone had traced the ditches with a marker. Silence. Then, oh, exactly. Oh, that autumn the harvest numbers became official. The ditch-adjacent fields produced some of the best yields on the farm. Not every field, not every acre, but enough. Enough to be impossible to ignore. The county noticed. Of course it did. Because farmers notice yields. They always notice yields. One morning Dale Harper walked into the diner carrying a harvest summary. Then sat heavily. No. Rick looked up. What? Dale slapped the paperwork onto the table. No. Silence. Then, what happened? Dale pointed at the numbers. Fish. Rick blinked. Fish. Fish. The table fell silent. Because nobody wanted that answer. Not really. The next year Margaret expanded the experiment. More tilapia. More ditch sections. More monitoring. More data. This time she documented everything. Water quality. Soil biology. Organic matter. Moisture retention. Earthworm counts. Everything. If people were going to criticize her, she wanted evidence. By midsummer things became difficult to dismiss. The irrigation channels stayed noticeably cleaner. Algae problems dropped. Sediment accumulation decreased. And the soil closest to the ditches continued improving. One crop consultant returned 3 separate times. Finally, he stood beside a ditch watching fish move through the water. Then shook his head. You know what bothers me? Margaret smiled. What? He pointed toward the tilapia. I don't understand why this works. Silence. Then, maybe because biology likes biology. The consultant stared, then laughed. Because as frustrating as the answer sounded, it also seemed true. The real breakthrough happened during a drought. A serious one. The kind farmers discussed for years afterward. Rain disappeared. Temperatures climbed. Fields across the county struggled. Every conversation centered on moisture, or the lack of it. One afternoon Dale stood beside a fence overlooking one of Margaret's fields, then looked across neighboring properties. The difference felt obvious. Her crops remained greener, healthier, more resilient. Not perfect, just better. Enough better to notice. Dale kicked at the dirt, then frowned. The soil felt different. Darker, softer, more alive. He hated that, because it reminded him of every joke he'd made, every fish comment, every seafood farm remark. All of it. One evening, he finally drove to Margaret's farm. Naturally, he found her standing beside a ditch. Tilapia moved through the water below. The setting sun reflected across the surface. For several seconds he simply stared. Then, no. Margaret laughed. Evening. Dale pointed toward the fish. No. Silence. What? This should not work. Margaret smiled slightly. Apparently. Dale shook his head. For 3 years I've been waiting for this to fail. Yes. Long pause. It's getting annoying. That answer made her laugh harder than expected. By the 4th year universities became interested. Then agricultural researchers. Then conservation groups. People started visiting the farm. Not because of the crops. Because of the system. The integration. The unusual combination of water management, nutrient cycling, and biological activity. One professor spent an entire afternoon studying ditch samples. Then another. Then another. Eventually, he looked at Margaret and said something she'd never expected. You may have stumbled onto something important. Silence. Then, accidentally. The professor smiled. Most discoveries happen that way. The county's attitude changed slowly. Very slowly. At first people mocked the idea, then ignored it, then questioned it, then copied it. That last stage always amused Margaret, because several of the same farmers who laughed the hardest eventually started stocking fish of their own. Not publicly, of course. Farmers rarely admit those things. But she noticed. Everyone noticed. Especially Dale. One autumn afternoon, he stood beside a newly stocked ditch on his own farm. Margaret happened to drive by. She stopped, got out, looked at the water, then looked at him. Long silence. Then, fish. Dale stared. Leave. Margaret smiled. You bought fish. Leave. You bought fish. Dale pointed toward the truck. Get off my property. She laughed all the way back to the road. 5 years after the original stocking experiment, the farm looked different. Not dramatically, just healthier. The soil contained more life. Organic matter increased. Water infiltration improved. Earthworms returned in remarkable numbers. Input costs stabilized. The fields handled stress better. Everything felt more resilient. One evening Margaret stood beside the same irrigation ditch where the first tilapia had been released years earlier. The water moved quietly through the channel. Fish darted beneath the surface. The fields beyond glowed beneath the setting sun. Emily walked over. You know what I find funny? Margaret smiled. What? Emily pointed toward the water. Everybody remembers the fish.